Hello and welcome to your first video on Edward VI revision. Just to let you know, we are now going into the second half of your studies, which is looking at England, turmoil and triumph. And that starts with the year 1547 at the beginning of Edward's reign, and it ends with 1603, which is the final year of Elizabeth's reign. This is now looking at Unit 3, which is called Instability and Consolidation, which is the mid-Tudor crisis years. We'll decide whether we think there was a mid-Tudor crisis at the end of this unit. And this basically goes from 1547 to 1563, so the first couple of years of Elizabeth's reign. First of all, it's important that you know what you need to be looking at when you're studying Edward. It's important that we think about the fact that there is obviously a minor reign here, and so you've got Somerset and Northumberland ruling on behalf of Edward, I suppose. And you've got to be aware of what's going on during the time that these guys are leading the country. So looking at royal authority, looking at problems with succession, which we know that there are key problems with in Edward's reign, particularly at the end. And we also need to be looking at foreign policy, rebellion, we need to be looking at religious change, economic issues. I will be covering all of these things, but I'm going to be covering it in two separate videos. So the first video is going to be on Somerset, and the second video is going to be on Northumberland. Within each of these videos, I will be covering things like royal authority, succession, foreign policy, religion, rebellion, economy, but I'll be doing it as part of what happens during the time that each of those men is in power. So I hope that will make it a little bit easier for you to revise. I find it an easier approach. That's why I've decided to do that. So the first thing I would like you to revise is Henry VIII's legacy and Edward's inheritance. It's important that I point out, first of all, that of course Edward was a 9-year-old king when he came to the throne, and so this of course created lots of problems in itself. There have been minor kings previously, and that had caused factional rivalry. We know there was the issue with the Prince in the Tower, and so it's not really the ideal situation. But Henry had made things much worse with his legacy. There are a number of things that I'd like you to revise, first of all. I want you to make sure that you're aware of Edward's inheritance and the issues that he faces as a new king. So thinking about religious division within the country because of Henry VIII's changes, make sure that you go back and recap what the situation was like with foreign policy. Also, there have been wars with France and Scotland, especially in those final years of Henry's reign. Make sure you're aware of that. I also want you to be aware of the financial situation in the country, the economy, particularly looking at things like debasing the coin, the inflation rates, and some of the problems that come with that, just that you're aware of what Edward's tackling in terms of his inheritance. And I also want you to go back and make sure that you're aware of the issue with monastic lands as well. Now, what I wanted to particularly focus on here is the fact that because monastic lands have been sold off, that then meant that the crown had actually compromised its own long-term security, as we know that gentry, nobility had taken that land, and so the king had sort of lost that power to control it all himself. It is important as well that you are aware that Henry VIII did not leave his son alone to rule, of course. He had left him with a regency council of 16 men. You're going to be looking at that in a little bit more detail on the next slide, but I do want you just to study this chart here that just tells you the names of each of the 16 councillors and what their professions were. You don't need to know that exactly by heart, but it's just so you're aware of who they are. And also, I wanted you to be aware of their religion if it is known. So what you will see is that there's a real mixture on the council here of Catholics and Reformers, but also some people that are neutral and are probably quite happy just to go with whatever the monarch states in terms of religion. But this just gives you a bit of a picture perhaps of who those conservatives are on the council, because their names might prop up as we go through the course, and also who the Reformers are as well, that are kind of embedding and trying to bring further Protestant change. So we're now going to go on and look at royal authority in the government. First of all, it's important to point out that we have just talked about in the previous slide that there was a regency council set up because Edward, of course, was a minor. And until he ended that minority period, he was going to have to be governed by this regency council. But the regency council didn't actually work out the way it was supposed to in Henry's will. Henry's will had stated that the regency council would be 60 members, supported by a further 12, and this would be a balance of reformists and conservatives. It would be a mixture of people with different skills, like administrators and lawyers, and it should also represent noble families, although these were underrepresented as well. But this didn't really work out the way it was supposed to. Of course, there was a balance of reformists and religious conservatives. There was a balance of people with different skills. But the council was supposed to act on a majority. So if the decision was supposed to be made, the majority of people were supposed to make a decision on that. But instead, it ended up being a situation where Edward had a Lord Protector from very early on, from 1547, where his uncle Edward Seymour had declared himself Lord Protector, and therefore all of the power was sort of delegated to him by the council. And so it wasn't actually carried out in the way that Henry had wished. So that tells a little bit about the Regency Council and the fact that it didn't really last very long. And obviously you're going to look in a bit more detail over the next few slides at how Seymour uses that power as Lord Protector. It's also important we do talk about royal authority and the fact that Edward, of course, as a minor king, did find it quite difficult to instill royal authority on the nation. Instead, he had other adult males, ambitious men around him that were sort of dominating that power until he obviously became of age. This, of course, would lead to factions. This is something that had happened in the past when there had been minority governments where different people have their own causes and they want to try and instill that onto the king and try and get control of the king. This is something that did happen, I suppose, under Edward. We definitely do see factional rivalry, and we do see, Somerset and Northumberland taking power of the king. I wouldn't argue that it had led to as much chaos, though, as it had in the past, so that's a good thing. But to try and instill this good order and security, and to try and make sure that the people of England saw Edward as the rightful king and that they couldn't sort of, discredit him because of his age, there was something published called a homily of obedience in 1547, and this was done by Archbishop Cranmer. And the idea is that this was supposed to set the tone, that it was absolutely important for people to make sure they continue to be obedient to the king, despite the fact that he was a 9-year-old boy, and the fact that he was selected by God, that it was the will of God that he was going to rule, and therefore any disobedience against Edward would be mortal sin, and people would, suffer in the afterlife. And this is something that was read out in churches. It was pushed upon the people in every part of the country. And this is very important because of the fact that, of course, he was a minor king. And what people like Cranmer didn't want is for people in various parts of the country to decide to rebel or disobey him in any way because of that fact. So this was just to try and instill that royal authority. And I do believe it would have been successful, as throughout Edward's reign, there aren't really any situations where people are disobeying him because of his age. They are mostly criticising his policies and practices. Now, before we get started looking at Somerset in a bit more detail and looking at the policies that he established throughout his time as leader, I wanted to start off just by reminding you about Edward Seymour's rise to power and how he becomes the Duke of Somerset and how he manages to take control of Edward. First of all, I'm not going to talk through this with you. I'm going to give you some time to pause it in a second. But I just want to point out that you do need to make sure that you're aware of the different titles that Edward Seymour has in his life. So sometimes textbooks will refer to him by his birth name as Edward Seymour. Some textbooks will refer to him as the Earl of Hertford, and some textbooks might refer to him as the Duke of Somerset or the Lord Protector, Lord High Admiral, whatever it may be. The fact is, historians will refer to him by his title depending on the time they are discussing. So if it is, looking at before 1547, they might refer to him as the Earl of Hertford rather than Duke of Somerset. And that's because he doesn't get the title as the Duke of Somerset until Edward's reign in 1547. So just be aware of that, because as you are doing any additional reading or going through your notes or going through the textbook, you might come across that. And I just want you to be aware that that is the same person, just in case you're not already. So when you're basically given time in a second to pause this slide, I just want you to be aware of how Somerset rises to power, what it was that he was particularly skilled in, how he managed to gain favour of Henry VIII, and of course, don't forget he is the brother of Jane Seymour, and so that has a massive contribution to his influence in government and the fact that he is chosen to be on the Regency Council when Henry dies. So I'm just going to give you some time now just to pause this. You might want to make some notes. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video now and highlight any key things that you would like to get down. So there are two things I'd like to be aware of when you're looking at Somerset's style of government. First of all, it's important we know that people at the time saw him as quite dictatorial in his style of government. He was essentially a king in all but name. Now, what I mean by that is that he bypassed the Privy Council and he governed largely through members of his own household. Only one of those members was actually placed on the Privy Council to support them. So generally, he would just bypass the Privy Council and work directly with people that supported him. Another thing that he does is he circulates the king with people that support Somerset. So, for example, Sir Michael Stanhope is one person who was very close to Seymour. He was his brother-in-law, and he was basically given really influential roles around the king. So, for example, the Groom of the Stool, and he was also Chief Gentleman of the Privy Chamber. So that means that he was in charge of all of the servants that served Edward. All of the people were close to him in his private moments, and it meant that he himself was very close to the king and would clearly have the king's ear and would be able to give influence to the king on a regular basis. So having someone that supported Seymour alongside the king in that way would, of course, really benefit Seymour or Somerset. Now, you do need to be aware of the impact of this. The most important thing is that, of course, it really angered the rest of the council and it really pushed out other important men. So, for example, the Earl of Southampton, we know from the downfall of Somerset, he had actually served Henry VIII as a very important minister, but he was pushed out and saw that basically Somerset was keeping the king under lock and key. And he found that to be really irritating. And it's one of the reasons why he obviously, acted against him in 1549. Now, of course, at the beginning, Somerset is able to make fairly swift decisions because he's not having to go through a process of voting to get a majority. But what we start to see later on over the next 2 years is that he starts to have a number of failings, particularly in areas like foreign policy. And this, of course, then starts to lead to his downfall in 1549 because people start to see that he's acting as a dictator, but the actions that he's actually taking are not even benefiting Edward and the government and England, essentially. So, of course, that means that he falls out of power quite quickly. The second thing you need to know about his style of government is that he has some quite progressive ideas for the time. So especially because of the fact that he himself is obviously a member of the aristocracy, and he works with members of the aristocracy, it's quite interesting that he's got these views that, he feels that he needs to really take care of or support the general people in England, the common people. And he has quite a lot of sympathies about the problems and the suffering that they experience in England. And he feels that this suffering is a result of the gentry, the nobility, the greed of gentlemen, he sees it as. And obviously, these kind of ideas really get under the skin of some of the other people on the council who, of course, are landowners. They are enclosing land. They're making a great deal of money from it, and they don't really care too much about the lives of the common people. And so the fact that he's kind of bringing up these concerns and investigating them through commissioners and things like that, that's just going to really agitate them and again lead to less popularity in the government for him. Now, again, when we're looking at the impact of this, it's important, again, that we talk about the fact that it just angered men at court. As I've just mentioned, these men, of course, were landowners. Many were making a great deal of money from these policies. And so they were quite angry at the fact that he was investigating them through commissions. And it made them even more angry, perhaps, that nothing actually came from those commissions, because it just sort of left the landowners angry, but then just sort of got the hopes up of the peasantry, but then did nothing to actually help them anyway. And so what would possibly happen is the peasantry might be more disobeying towards the lords because they feel that perhaps something is going to change at some point soon. But obviously this was just kind of seen as a very different way of noble life to what had ever been seen in any previous reigns. And so he was considered quite unpopular for those reasons as well when it came to other members of the government. So as we know, Edward inherited a number of issues from his father, Henry VIII. We know that, for example, he'd left him with a bankrupt throne. The crown's finances were in a really troubling situation. We also know that there was religious confusion and issues with foreign policy. So what I'm going to be doing on these next few slides is just basically showing you what Somerset does to deal with each of these issues. So I'll talk to you about the problem that existed, what Somerset actually did, and how effective he was in dealing with the problem. I'm not going to read all of this stuff out for you. Instead, I'm going to give you an opportunity to pause the video on each slide, make some notes for yourselves, and highlight any of those key areas. But what I do want to point out is that on this particular section, we're looking at the Crown's financial position. There is quite a lot of crossover actually with foreign policy, because obviously the Crown's financial situation was largely in the state it was because of the wars against France and Scotland. And what I'd like you to do is just basically get down any details that you can about what Somerset did to try and combat that in terms of, the issues of foreign policy causing a great deal of money. And I'd like you to look at how effective he was in dealing with it. So just make sure you get some notes down on those areas. And I'll just give you some time to pause the video now before you switch on to the next issue. So as you can see, the second issue that we're going to be looking at for Somerset is the issues with religious change and the confusion around that. Now, as we know, of course, England was in a situation of religious confusion because of the reign of Henry VIII. Okay, now Henry VIII had started the Protestant Reformation. He'd sort of triggered it with the break from Rome, making himself the head of the church. That is ultimately a Protestant idea. And he had gone through some doctrinal changes, particularly obviously with the 10 Articles, but then he'd obviously reversed those things when he passed the 6 Articles 3 years later. We also know that he'd introduced an English Bible into the country, and initially that was accessible to everybody. But then, of course, in 1543, he then reduces that and makes it so that only the noble men of the country are able to access the Bible, as he feels that too many women and lower class individuals are getting too many opinions and interpretations about the Bible, that he feels that is inappropriate. So we do know that there's a bit of confusion in terms of what the standing is in terms of religion. And this is very important to the people of England, especially at a time when you can be persecuted, burned alive if you get it wrong. We know that Henry, of course, did persecute people because of their religious standings at various points in his reign. And that could continue to happen. So people wanted to know where they stood. How much does Somerset do to deal with this religious confusion? What you've got to do is just, again, make sure that you've got some notes on what the issues are for Somerset. Now, I just want to point out, please, guys, that Somerset does face further issues in terms of pressures for further Protestant change because of key points which I have mentioned in the first column for you. So, for example, exiled Protestants coming back to the country or coming back to England, the reformed factions in government sort of pushing for him to create more change. And of course, the fact that there's the relaxation of the press censorship, which basically means that there are greater numbers of pamphlets from Martin Luther, for example, circulating the country, and you get a lot more radical views being shared within the population. And don't forget that Edward VI himself was quite a force to be reckoned with when it came to religion. He was quite an adamant Protestant that really wanted to instill a Protestant church and ensure that everybody in the country followed that. So we need to now look at what it was that Somerset actually does to combat this religious confusion. I'd like you to make some notes about that and then sort of make a judgment for yourselves about how effective you feel he was in dealing with the issue of religious confusion. Does he manage to, for example, establish an official Protestant church? Does he make doctrinal changes that make it very clear for all churches how they are supposed to worship? And does he make it so that these laws sort of have to be enforced and accepted? So I'm going to pause the video for you. Well, I'm going to ask you guys to pause the video now and give you an opportunity just to make some notes. The third issue that you need to be looking at is the problems with foreign policy. Now, again, we know from Henry VIII's reign that there had been an ongoing aim of his to be a warrior king, to conquer land in France. He hadn't done that in his earlier years. He attempted to do it again from 1540 to 1547. We know that there were obviously attempted invasions in France or Scotland as they were allied together. And we know that there had been some successes, but there had been a great deal of failure as well. We know that, for example, the Mary Rose sank. There was the invasion of the Isle of Wight. And of course, there was the loss in the Battle of Ancre-Moor as well. So what we can see here is that there was a real conflict between England and, of course, France and Scotland as a combined force. And that wasn't really dealt with at the end of Henry's reign. So basically, Edward just inherits this conflict. Now, although there wasn't actively a war going on when he inherits the throne, the issue is still there. So what you've got to look at, obviously, is what does Somerset do to combat this? Now, it's particularly a problem because of the fact that Henry's will had stated that Edward should go on to marry Mary, Queen of Scots. That is something that he really wanted, and he had tried to get the Scots to agree to it in the Treaty of Venice in 1543, but they had not ratified the treaty, and that's one of the reasons he decided to be aggressive towards them. But that was still part of his will. Somerset still had to try and ensure that that marriage took place, and what you've got to do is look at what Somerset actually did surrounding that issue, and whether he was successful in squashing these issues with France and Scotland, or whether he was perhaps successful in beating them in battles, for example. So I'm going to again give you an opportunity to pause the video again now so you can make some notes for yourselves before we move on to the fourth and final issue. So the fourth problem we're going to be looking at for Somerset is the issues surrounding the social and economic issues in the country. We know that Henry VIII, of course, had created a great deal of these, starting with the debasement of the coin, leading to inflation in the country, which was a phenomenon that people didn't really understand at this time, and so really failed to get it under wraps or to deal with it in any kind of way. We also know that some of the enclosures, for example, and the other agricultural policies in the country were causing a lot of issues for people socially as well. So, for example, engrossing of farms, placing them together was causing homelessness. We know that enclosures was leading to unemployment as less farmers were needed for sheep farming than what they would be needed for crop farming. So we know that, of course, prices were rising. There was rack renting going on. But on top of that, it is important we understand that there were some things outside of the monarch's control, like bad harvests as well, which again made it very difficult for people at times when there just wasn't enough food to go around. So if there are these issues that has existed from Henry VIII's reign, what we need to look at is how does Somerset try to combat that? First of all, it's important that you're aware that he did want to do something about this. Somerset had a reputation as the good duke. We know that he actually had, some sort of a duty to care for the poor. He felt that, and he wanted to do something about it. He wasn't very good at dealing with it, actually, but he had those aims. He wanted to basically reduce the suffering of those that had suffered at the the hands of the greedy land elites previously. So he has these high expectations, but what does he actually do about it? That's what you need to make sure that you make some notes on here. So I'm going to give you, again, a bit of time here just to pause the video and make some notes about what Somerset did to try and combat these problems within society and within the economy. And can you make a judgment as well about whether you feel that he was effective in dealing with this issue? Make sure that you're quite confident on that judgment. Towards the end of this video, I'll ask you overall what you feel about Somerset's actions in all 4 of these areas. So the final thing we need to look at when we're talking about Somerset is his dealing with rebellion. Now, rebellion was a big issue in 1549 particularly, and that's the time, of course, that Somerset is in power. It's important that you know, though, it's not just in 1549. In the first 2 years of Edward's reign, there's a great deal of rioting and rebelling going on across the country. 23 counties in total were affected by riots and rebellion. Most of them were obviously squashed by local gentry and so weren't considered to be a concern for the government. There were 2 in particular in 1549 alone that were large-scale rebellions that did become a cause for concern with the government. And of course, they had to create measures to squash those rebellions quite quickly and harshly. But it's also important that you know about the situation in terms of the impact of these riots and rebellions. About 10,000 people actually died in unrest across the country, which in terms of, if you think about the population today, that's equivalent to around 165,000 people in the 21st century, because obviously the population was much small. So if you think about a percentage, it's a huge amount of people at the time, and that happened throughout the country in those 23 issues that existed. But what you guys have to be aware of particularly is the major rebellions that occurred under Somerset. So you've got the Western Rebellion, first of all, in the West Country, I should say, and then you've also got the Ket's Rebellion in Norfolk as well. So basically, you need to be aware of the causes of the rebellions, which there are a number of causes in both of these rebellions. It's quite clear that there are a great deal of issues in England at this time. It's not like there is one policy that they are particularly angry about. For example, if you look at Henry VII's reign, and you've got the Cornish Rebellion and the Yorkshire Rebellion, and their primary concern is taxation. That is what they're really angry about. It seems in these rebellions that they've got a lot to be angry about. It's a combination of religious issues, but also economic and social issues as well. They're really quite prominent for the rebels at this time. And also it's quite important to note that the Western Rebellion and the Ket's Rebellion have different stances when it comes to religion. So, in the Western Rebellion, it's Catholics marching against the Protestant changes. Whereas in the Ket's Rebellion, you've got Protestants who want to see greater Protestant change. That just demonstrates how much religious confusion there was at this time and how much people were just looking for some guidance on what was going to happen with religion in the country. So you need to be aware of the different causes. You need to be aware of the demands of the rebels in both the rebellions, and of course the general events that occur. Although you'll never be asked to describe the events of rebellion, you're going to be asked more about the causes and the consequences of them as opposed to the actual events. But it's always good to know a bit about what happened, especially in terms of how many people were involved, how much they managed to capture in terms of any territory, for example, if there was any huge losses of life. And of course, in terms of the suppression, you need to know about the executions. You need to know about how leaders were treated by Edward at the end. So I've got basically 2 slides on this. So this is the first slide on the Western Rebellion. So I'm going to ask you guys to spend a bit of time making some notes on this. I'll give you a chance to pause it in a second. But just to make you aware, I have got another video on my YouTube channel that is about these 2 rebellions where I do talk through it in lots of detail. And I also talk about kind of an assessment of the rebellions at the end of it as well. So if you are feeling that rebellions is an area that you need to work on and you don't feel confident with this, you might feel that you want to stretch onto that video as well, just to sort of delve into this a bit deeper with me as I talk through it in a lot more detail and read through it all with you. So just bear that in mind. But I'm going to give you an opportunity to pause the video now so that obviously you can read through this information, make some notes, and then we'll move on to the second rebellion on the next slide. So this is the second slide about Somerset dealing with rebellion, and this one's focused on the Ket's Rebellion in Norfolk. Again, you need to make notes on the causes, the demands of the rebels, the events, the suppression of the rebellion. And just like with the Western Rebellion, there are lots of different causes, including religious issues, but also social and economic. Now, unlike the Western Rebellion, where religion takes the greatest sort of primary concern from the rebels, In this rebellion, it is much more about social and economic issues. Of course, religious issues and religious concerns are definitely an underlying issue for many rebels. The greatest concern in this rebellion is enclosures and social issues, particularly clashes with the gentry members in the region as well. So just bear that in mind for this one. And just remember that there is that other video. If you wanted to look at rebellion in a little bit more detail, I have got that on my YouTube channel as well. I'll make a link to it in the description box for this video so that you can go on to look at it in a bit more detail if you need to. So if you pause the video now, and then you can do some notes on this section. What I then like to look at with you is just assessing Somerset's reaction in both of these rebellions, because the rebellions themselves didn't directly lead to Somerset's downfall, but they certainly contributed to it. Now, many people, I suppose, throughout history have sort of seen Somerset's unwillingness to act during these uprisings as seen as sort of evidence that he sympathised with the rebels, that he cared about their concerns, especially, I suppose, with the Ketz Rebellion and enclosures being their primary concern. But actually, it's more likely, really, that these initial delays to act were actually caused more by the fact that the local elites in the areas were not willing to intervene without government support. And there's also the issue with there's a real lack of money from the government to be able to come and deal with these issues. And so they do start, especially the Ketz Rebellion, does get more out of hand. And also Somerset really struggles to raise an army because he's got people obviously on the garrisons in Scotland protecting the area there. And he's not willing to bring them home. And so it takes its time where the council actually starts to realise that these rebellions are getting really serious before they actually ask for additional troops from people like Lord Russell or John Dudley, who step in to help Somerset. And that's obviously, again, where we see John Dudley really rise to power as he sort of demonstrates himself as a more worthy leader than Somerset in these rebellions. So I'm going to give you some time to make some notes on that assessing of Somerset's reaction if you'd like to as well. Just helps you to sort of think about the suppression of the rebellions and Somerset's actions within that. I'd now like to look at Somerset's fall from power, specifically looking at why he falls from power, why he becomes so unpopular, particularly with members of the Privy Council. I think it's quite obvious why a lot of people would have disliked him on the Privy Council because of his high-handed management, the fact that he ruled from his protector's palace, he had sort of kept the king under lock and key, preventing anybody else from really being able to influence him, surrounding him with his own supporters, and also just generally not delegating anything to anybody else and taking the power for himself. Of course, this was agitated those other members of the council who felt that Henry VIII's will had said that they were going to have equal influence over the king as anybody else on the council. But we also know that the decisions he had made were quite often unsuccessful. So, for example, his decisions in foreign policy were unsuccessful. There was the failed campaign in Scotland, the fact that he was not able to wed Edward to Mary Queen of Scots. He also was, spending a huge amount of money on foreign policy as well for not a lot of gain. And then obviously we've got to think about the fact that he fails to really solve things when it comes to religious reform. So there's a real cautious approach going on from Somerset, which just agitates people from both sides. People feel very confused by it. That's very evident in 1549 with the two rebellions of the Ketz and Wester Rebellion, who have very different ideas and opinions about where religion should be going. The fact that he's 2 years into it and that's still not clear doesn't really make things look good for him. And then you've also got to think about the way that he deals with those rebellions in 1549. The fact that in the Ketz Rebellion, John Dudley has to step in and use his forces to deal with the rebellion, as it hadn't been taken seriously by Somerset, and he hadn't really used the troops that he had available to him in the correct ways. Instead, they were still garrisoned in Scotland. You've also got to think about the fact that he was seen as really unpopular because of his social views. So the fact that, of course, he was really critical of enclosures. He'd alienated the aristocracy. He had investigated them through commissions. And obviously he hadn't really resolved any of those issues with the peasantry either. But that, of course, had just made him really unpopular with those people on the council. And on top of that, he had kind of given himself all of the key positions. He'd put all his own men in the key positions, and he'd paid himself huge incomes as well. He'd accumulated a number of different salaries and offices, chantry lands as well, obviously once the Chantries Act had been passed in 1547. And so this just basically made it look like he was, kind of, I suppose, taking all of the power and wealth for himself and not really delegating it effectively and fairly to other people in the council, which he didn't. We've also got to think about how he falls from power. So obviously he falls from power largely because of the fact that he become very unpopular for a number of reasons. But he'd been abandoned essentially by the other ambitious men on the council, and they basically wanted to rebel against him. They wanted to remove him from power. And once obviously this becomes clear, he then removes Edward from his, comfortable accommodation, and he takes him to Windsor Castle, where he is very uncomfortable. He feels like he's been kidnapped essentially, and he makes that quite clear to Somerset that he's falling out of favour with the king because of the fact that he feels like he's being taken against his will to a very uncomfortable place of accommodation. And so when he falls from power, there isn't really any opposition, not even from the king, who of course was his nephew. Obviously, he's not killed straight away. He's arrested. He's removed from the Privy Council. He does rejoin the Privy Council, but that's in 1550. But by the way, he then basically again gets involved in plots against Northumberland in particular, and then that's when he is executed in January 1552. So that basically tells us a bit about his fall from power. I'd like you to pause the video and just make any notes that you can about why he falls from power in terms of his popularity, but also how he falls from power. Now, I don't feel that I'm going to spend a lot of time going over and over the coup led by Northumberland in terms of the fall from power. But if you feel that you don't understand that, then you need to go back to your lesson notes and have a look at that in a bit more detail, just so that you're aware of what happened there. It's not something you're going to have to describe in an exam question scenario, but it is important for your background knowledge just to understand that. So go back to your notes on that from lesson if you feel you need to. So the final thing for you to do today is to make a judgment about how successful you think Somerset was overall as a ruler. Do you think that he was really successful in all areas? Do you think that there were some areas he was successful in? Do you think he was a complete failure in dealing with any of the issues that Edward inherited? There are a number of things that obviously you need to consider as part of this. So looking at whether it solved the issue with religious confusion. Did he, restore the crown's finances to a good state? Did he manage to solve the issues with the economy, for example, with the debased coin, enclosures that were obviously causing unemployment, and so on and so forth? If you feel that he was successful in any of these areas, then please make that clear as part of your judgment. If you feel that he wasn't, then again, just make sure that you justify your judgment with evidence from the session you've done with this PowerPoint. You might also want to consider historians' views about Somerset. This is particularly useful when it comes to counteracting perhaps or supporting what historians might say in an extract question. If you've got some banks of historians' quotes about certain issues throughout the Tudor period. So you might want to write down those two quotes there about what two historians have said about Somerset. So they might come in handy in an essay at some point if you know them by heart. Thank you so much for listening today, guys, and I hope it's been useful. Please speak to me if you need any more help with Somerset's rule.